Bună seara tuturor! Bine ați revenit în aula Magna UVT. Este fără îndoială o seară foarte specială, din mai multe motive. În primul rând pentru că avem alături de noi doi scriitori ale căror voci chiar contează. Contează în literatura din România, contează în Europa, contează din punct de vedere civic. Ajută foarte mult, cred, și titlul. E o întrebare care, cu siguranță, ne dă mult de gândit. Poate literatura să salveze o țară? Vom afla în seara asta. Rămânem în orice caz optimiști și sperăm că poate, măcar literatura. N-am să le fac introduceri foarte lungi, cu siguranță le-ați citit cărțile. Apropo, probabil ați văzut, în fața sălii este un stand de la librăria La Două Bufnițe. După ce... Bravo La Două Bufnițe! După eveniment, ca de obicei, autografele se dau aici pe scenă, vom aduce o masă și puteți să-i salutați și să luați un autograf. Bun, până atunci, desigur, ca de obicei, după dialog, vreme de 20-25 de minute, vor ajunge microfoane în sală și puteți să intrați în dialog cu cei doi scriitori invitați. Bun, cum spuneam, n-am pregătit introduceri foarte lungi, am selectat 3 titluri pentru fiecare. Apropo, Radu, pentru că știu că tu comunici adesea cu chat-ul, nu? L-am întrebat ce cărți ai scris și printre altele mi-a spus că ai scris o carte de-a lui Moni Stănilă, Războiul Solomonarilor.
Aș fi vrut eu.
Să știi că te-am părât, am vorbit astăzi cu Moni și am spus că, într-un fel, chat-ul și cu tine aveți acolo...
O conspirație.
O conspirație, da. Totuși ai scris Frânghia înflorită, Transparența, Boala și războiul, jurnal 2020-2024. În cazul amândurora am selectat câte un premiu. Radu, în cazul tău am zis că poate e relevant unul dintre cele mai recente, Gala Tinerelor Scriitori, ediția a 14-a, Cartea de poezie anului 2023, Cadiș. În cazul lui Andrei Kurkov, căruia i-a luat aproximativ 24 de ore să ajungă în Timișoara, e varianta fericită pentru că altfel ar fi durat 48 de ore. Chiar și așa, de dimineață a dat multe interviuri și iată-l aici gata să ne spună foarte multe lucruri cu sens. Am să spun la fel 3 titluri. Moartea pinguinului, Lăptarul de la miezul nopții și, desigur, Albinele gri. Și am selectat un premiu, Premiul Medicis pentru literatură străină. L-a primit pentru Albinele gri. Scriitorii au un lucru în comun, amândoi au fost președinți, sau sunt președinți, drept că nu președinți de țară, dar cine știe, sunt relativ tineri. Sunt președinți, a fost de fapt Radu, președintele PEN România, iar Andrei Kurkov, președintele PEN Ucraina. Bun, n-aș mai lungi eu foarte mult. Although, there is one more thing, Andrei. One day, probably, most likely, you will receive the Nobel Prize for Literature, and you have to make a promise to all of us. You'll come again to the West University in Timișoara when this happens.
Immediately.
Immediately. Pinky promise? Pinky promise.
I promise.
Radu, cum se spune, ai preluat legătura, sau ți-am dat legătura, sau cum o fi?
Mulțumesc, Alex. I'm going to switch to English. Of course, I will not repeat all the scandalous things he said about you just a few seconds ago. We all know that Andrei Kurkov is one of the, not only one of the major Ukrainian writers today, but one of the major European writers. His voice has been heard, especially after the war started on the massive scale after 2022. But his works have been translated into Romanian before that. We will use the time for tonight discussing about 70-75 minutes between ourselves. I will vampirize him, and after 70-75 minutes, I will try to open the floor to you, questions from the audience. So, Andrei, when we were trying to find a topic for tonight's discussion, I was thinking about the uses of literature in dark times it seemed to me very grand, so to say, but you suggested a question which is even grander, so to say. Can literature save a country? I think I would start our discussion by repeating something I've heard from you, I think maybe in Krakow, maybe someplace else. You said that after the war started, people returning from the front, people who were not readers of literature or of history, demanded history books and literature or even poetry books, even though they had not read poetry before. Why do you think that happens? Why do people need history and literature when they face death or when they face mass murder or this huge amount of suffering that war brings?
Good afternoon, and I'm extremely happy that you all understand and speak English. It's incredible. The number of students and actually inhabitants of Timișoara who are English speaking is unbelievable. I hope that royal family in the UK do not know this, because then they would probably
actually King Charles, I'm not sure if you know that, King Charles has a property in Transylvania, somewhere near Sibiu.
Oh, that's why.
Owns a
Okay,
castle there. Okay.
That's why. Well, I mean, you asked a very important question, but it will require several answers. First of all, let's remember 24th of February 2022. I mean, the war started in 2014 with annexation of Crimea and beginning of the war in Donbass, which was fought by separatists and so-called Russian volunteers. For Ukrainians, now it is 11 years of war behind us. 24th of February 2022 was different because this was the attack on the country of the level that you can compare with the attack of Nazi Germany against the Soviet Union. So all of Ukraine was shelled with missiles. And me and my wife, we were woken up by the explosions of missiles in Kyiv at 5 a.m. in the morning. And actually, if you live in a European capital, in a city with 3-4 million people, the city which is 1,540 years old, and suddenly you hear the explosions of real missiles, you understand that this is not escalation of the Donbass war or conflict, it's something different. I mean, it sounded like the beginning of the World War III. And Ukrainian army was not really prepared for this because President Zelensky was repeating every day that there will be no war, Putin is blackmailing us. So all these 150,000 soldiers, they are just to put pressure on Ukraine. And on the first day, of course, half of Ukrainian population tried to escape to the west. The roads were blocked. I mean, we have only one main road from Kyiv to Poland via Lviv. And actually, if you saw at this moment, on this day, the GPS, it was complete red line. I mean, I left with my wife on the second day. We went to Transcarpathia and to Zakarpattia. But even on the second day, the traffic jams were 70 kilometers long, 50 kilometers long, etc. So the country was in shock. At the same time, there were thousands of volunteers of young people and not very young people with no weapon going to the east to defend Ukraine, to defend the country. And there were people who were already men going from abroad, Ukrainians who lived abroad and worked abroad, they were returning to Ukraine to defend the country. So actually, I mean, there was this, I would say, contradictory movement, escape from the war and the movement of thousands and thousands of men towards the front line, towards, first of all, of course, Kyiv was under attack, and actually people were going to defend Kyiv and they couldn't find weapon. So, I mean, at some point, the military decided to give Kalashnikovs to anybody who registered as territorial defense group. And it was a very tragic moment because many people who were enthusiastic and wanted to defend their villages, their towns, Kiev, they didn't have any military experience. So some of them, they received Kalashnikovs and they didn't have a chance to use it. They were killed by Russian tanks. And I mean, there are videos from that time, horrible videos, where Russians arrested 7 or 8 men near Borodyanka, and they just shot them dead. And I mean, these people, I mean, were not in uniform, Ukrainians, they were in territorial defense. So when Kiev was finally defended and the Russian army had to retreat to Belarus, then actually Ukrainians went to the east to defend the front line which existed from 2015 between occupied Donbass and free Donbass. And there was a moment when some of them suddenly realized that they don't know enough about their own country that they are defending. And there were requests, they were asking their friends and relatives living away from the front line to send them non-fiction books on Ukrainian history. Because in the Soviet time, there was no Ukrainian history. There was Soviet history / Russian history. And only after 1991, historians started actually recreating research in Ukrainian history, which was silenced, which didn't exist for the Soviet Union. And these books, like a book by Sergei Plokhy, it's actually a Canadian-Ukrainian professor, The Gate of Europe. This book is now translated in many languages. I mean, this was the most in demand because this book, in a very simple way, explained what was happening in Ukraine, on Ukrainian territory, in different epochs. And this was, it was not fashionable, it was just like a necessity. Because, I mean, if you defend your country, you are risking your life and you want at least to know how your country was defended before and why the independence was lost and everything else. And what was even more important, you needed to know the history of Russian-Ukrainian relationship because this war is run on 3 levels. The bottom level is actually the Russian war to occupy all of Ukraine and to return it back to the new Russian Empire or new Soviet Union. It is difficult not because Ukraine has better soldiers. It is difficult because the difference between Russian mentality and Ukrainian mentality is quite big. Russians are collective people. They always lived in a monarchy. I mean, what we have now, it's a Putin is Tsar. He is not president because he is not replaced by another president during elections. And the Soviet Union was also a monarchy because only one general secretary of the Communist Party, 1 out of 6, was thrown from the power. I'm talking about Nikita Khrushchev. Everybody else, just like Putin, remained after so-called elections until they died. So, I mean, this tradition of passive collectivism is very strong in Russia until today, and that's why there is no opposition. And just like in the Soviet Union, there is only one ruling party. Now it is called United Russia. It's Putin's party. Ukraine, unlike Russia, never had a proper royal family. Ukraine had some kingdoms, like Galician kingdom with Danilo Galitsky as Tsar, some other. Ukraine was part of Lithuanian kingdom, Lithuanian-Polish Commonwealth, part of Poland, part of Habsburg Empire, etc. But Ukrainians were not used to have their own Ukrainian Tsar, which meant that for them, actually, all the Tsars were foreigners. And they themselves, they remained individualists, because when Ukraine was free in 17th century, they were choosing their leaders. The leaders were not elected, they were chosen on the general meeting of senior Cossacks, one could say in a modern language. And actually very often they were chosen as hetmans, and then immediately there would be intrigues to replace them because somebody else was unhappy with their decisions. So actually Ukrainian society from 17th century is a society with a very strong presence of anarchy. Anarchy and individualism, because everybody who took part in the choosing a hetman understood that he has influence on the future of the country. Today, the result of this history and mentality, we have more than 400 political parties registered in the Ministry of Justice of Ukraine. Because every Ukrainian who is active, he wants to create his own party or her own party. And it's a problem. It's a problem, but it's also actually the factor that makes dictatorship in Ukraine impossible. Because Ukrainians choose a leader and then they hate the leader. And there is a traditional disrespect for any power, for any government. So sometimes I think actually they choose a leader in order to have somebody guilty for everything which goes wrong. So I'm just explaining why history is important. I mean, what I'm saying is not directly written in these books on Ukrainian history, but history makes you either proud of your country, or curious, or sometimes depressed. I think Germans are quite often depressed by their history. I hope that Russians will be depressed by their history in the future. But generally, historical books, non-fiction, became popular exactly because when you are fighting for your country, you feel that you lack education. And this is your last chance, maybe, to find out the truth about your country. When we are talking about poetry, poetry becomes very important during any war, because poetry is short, is emotional, and a soldier in 2 minutes break between battles, he can listen or he can read it, and it gives the motivation. I had been traveling with the best poet in Ukraine, Sergei Zhadan, in 2015, along the front lines in Donbass. And we had meetings with soldiers and officers, and I was watching the soldiers, how they were listening to the poems. And actually, after poems, many of them were crying. This, like, I don't know, I mean, it's emotional recharge. And it's very, very important for somebody who is worn out, who is exhausted, who doesn't see any good in the nearest future. Because poetry refers to your children, to your childhood, to your happy moments, to your parents, to your loved ones. And that's why also after the beginning of the full-scale invasion, the minibuses with Ukrainian young poets were traveling everywhere along the front line, and the poets were reading to the soldiers the poems. And these poems, I mean, like in Ireland, they were not becoming financial bestsellers, but they were in demand. And what happens also during the war, many soldiers, when they are introduced to poetry, they begin to write poetry. And I know several soldiers who are writing poetry in Japanese style, and they are sending it to me. So with some sense of humor, irony, because I mean you need some kind of not escape from the reality, but you need support, internal support. So yes, this was the first 6 months of the full-scale invasion. You didn't ask me, but I will add to this that these 6 months were very different from the next months and from the previous months, because in these 6 months, from February 24 until probably July, August, the soldiers, apart from fighting, they were recording funny videos for Ukrainians who are not military, for the civilians, and they were sending them back in order to motivate the civil population. Because in fact, actually, a civil population of Ukraine was more shocked and more traumatized psychologically in the beginning of the war than the soldiers. They were facing the reality, death and actually the danger. But they were worried about actually how people bear it, behind them. And then 6 months later, these videos disappeared. There were no more videos recorded, no more soldiers' humor, because already by that time the soldiers were exhausted, and they didn't have energy to make these videos, to make fun, to have jokes.
When you were speaking about the traditional disrespect for the president in Ukraine, well, we kind of also have it in Romania, but I remembered about a poem written by Yuri Vinichuk, a poem called Kill the Bugger, yeah. Exactly, yeah. So he was arrested and he had to sign a statement, an official statement, that he doesn't really want to kill the bugger, that is just a poem. And he stated in the statement, he said, well, I do think he is a bugger, but I don't think I want to kill him. And he got away with it. And one of the policemen, when getting out of the room, whispered to Vinichuk, I loved the poem. It's a very good poem. Yeah. But then you were speaking about the history of Russian and Ukrainian relations, and some other thing came into my mind. I was shocked when I discovered that a poet I admired and I considered to be an absolute Democrat, Joseph Brodsky, has written that horrific poem against the independence of Ukraine in 1991. So my image on Brodsky was not only that of a wonderful, admirable poet, but that of an absolute Democrat. There is this TV show which is easily findable on YouTube. It's called, I'll remember in a minute, but it's a TV show recorded in 1982, moderated by L. Alvarez, an important poet critic, with Joseph Brodsky, Mary McCarthy, and George Steiner participating. And it was a beautiful but false idea of George Steiner that only totalitarianisms produce masterpieces. And they were arguing against the idea and George Steiner for the idea. And Steiner said, look, you have the example of Solzhenitsyn, who was still the impeccable figure. He has not transformed into the anti-Semite, which unfortunately he became. And Brodsky said, look, George, you know how much I admire Solzhenitsyn. But if you would ask me to choose between democracy and Solzhenitsyn, I would unhesitatingly choose democracy. So I thought, look, this is a perfect Democrat. And then I discovered that in 1991, when Ukraine was becoming independent, he wrote a poem which literally says, if you Ukrainians want to become independent, I wish you to be simultaneously raped by the Poles and the Germans. And this is it's a much longer poem, but all the lines have this violence and this hatred. And I was really surprised. Then I remembered about Pushkin writing something similar about against the independence of Poland 1 century and a few decades before. Also mocking the national poet, the national Polish poet, Mickiewicz, like Brodsky was mocking Taras Shevchenko. And this is my question to you. Why do you think there is this hatred against the independence of Ukraine, manifested even by the apparently perfect Democrats in Russia? Where does it stem from?
Well, first of all, I wouldn't use the word Democrats referring to these people. I mean, this is the paradox that if somebody is subconsciously indoctrinated as an imperialist, because I mean the proper Soviet people, they were imperialists. They believed that they live in the biggest country of the world, and this country belongs to them with all the minorities, either named or unnamed. And actually, and this is still the major pride of Russians, that they are the biggest nation, And if they are the biggest nations, they are, which is not true, of course. I mean, let's talk about India and China, etc. But everybody else on the edges of Russian Empire, they are small people. They're small countries. And when Russian intellectuals or Democrats are saying that they don't like Putin and they're against the war, it doesn't mean that they are Democrats. And actually, I mean, there are lots of examples in the interviews when the Russian opposition figures abroad, they use a lot democratic language, sort of the wordings, etc. But if you talk about, ask them about Ukraine or Baltic states, they suddenly say that, well, I mean, these are small, nasty people who hate everything Russian. So, I mean, they are on the defensive. But they are thinking that they are on the defensive of their national pride. But, I mean, national pride is based on suppression of other nations. And this, I mean, they don't understand it naturally. I mean, they are sincere people in this sense. They don't understand how Ukraine can be independent if it used to belong to Russian Empire. If Ukrainian aristocracy was allowed to move to Russia, to become nobles or rich people in Russia. So, I mean, it's a complex issue. But it has nothing to do with democracy. And so, I mean, Brodsky, with one poem, lost several million of his fans in Ukraine. And I think there are many poets like this, like him. So that's why Ukrainians don't trust Russian opposition neither in Russia nor in the West. Because yes, they may be against Putin, but they are not against Russian Empire as a concept, and great Russian history and great Russian culture, etc. So I mean, they are the defenders actually of the myth, and they don't want to see Russia becoming less important in the world, which means that they want to have strong Russia, and strong Russia is always aggressive. Because if you check the history, I mean, Russia was always at war. And it looks like actually the war is the main instrument to keep the level of Russian patriotism very high.
So, what can words which are simply air do against such an imperialistic, aggressive nation built on war? When I was thinking about the topic, I remember something Falstaff says in Henry IV. He says, "What is honor? A word. What is the word honor? Air." So what can the air of words do against these huge empires built on war? So that we can approach how literature can save countries under the menace of such militaristic empires.
Well, I mean, what is happening now with Russian culture and with Russia is the repeat of the events that followed October Revolution of 1917. There was a huge exodus of Russian intellectuals. Maxim Gorky left the country, everybody else left the country. They started creating parallel Russia in Prague, Berlin, Paris, Belgrade. They started opening publishing houses and newspapers in Russian and creating parallel Russian culture. And this is what's happening now. Boris Akunin, who cannot come back because he is accused of being a traitor, he started a publishing house in London. I mean, there are other publishing houses that are about to be open in other countries. There is a new bookshop in London, Russian bookshop, which is called Idei. And this is interesting because, I mean, this is a reference, of course, to Dostoevsky, and which means actually the bookshop supports the same myth about mysterious Russian soul and as is supported by Putin. and by Russians. But anyway, the word itself cannot do much, whether it is a word in immigration or inside Russia. The word is addressed to readers. If suddenly this word becomes a song or becomes very popular with the readers or becomes a joke, it becomes more dangerous. And then actually it can change not the ideology of people, but perception of the reality. I mean, what is the proper word always fighting? Is fighting against false reality, the reality that is negative and dangerous. And that's why actually the writers who disagree with regimes, and journalists even more, they are in danger because they are influencing, they are not influencing the votes, because if you have a regime, you don't have free vote. But they're influencing the attitude of silent people towards the power. And I think this is the motivation in Russia now, because like in 1920-25, the good literature, honest literature, is replaced with ideological literature. So the quality of literature doesn't play any role now. The main thing is that the literature should work for the state, should work for the new Russian patriotism and for the old Russian power, which is still there.
What you are saying reminds me of Leszek Kołakowski's conclusion from the main currents of Marxism, when after studying all the communisms of the planet, he reaches this conclusion, which is formulated not even philosophically, but aphoristically. He says, lie is the immortal soul of communism. I could replace communism with any totalitarianism. I think it's a huge institution made of verbal lies. And do you think it's possible within such a totalitarianism built on mega institutionalized lie, do you think it's possible to preserve at least some words clean, to preserve the truth in at least some words, via literature maybe?
Well, in the Soviet time, the only instrument which was efficient against the official ideological lie was a culture of oral jokes, anecdotes. And this culture was turning Soviet ideology into nothing, into rubbish. And it's interesting that even the communists themselves, who were a privileged class, they liked these jokes and they were sharing these jokes between themselves, which probably means that with the help of these jokes, they were somehow accepting that they are lying in real life, but this is their way of life. So they were becoming actors, comedians for themselves. But otherwise, I don't know, for example, situation in Albania when Hoxha was the head of the state, because I have never heard Albanian jokes. But I think there might be different kinds of weapons made of words. I mean, it could be poetry also, it could be graffitis.
Alex said in his presentation that I used to ask ChatGPT or Grok, artificial intelligence, questions. About 1 week ago, I asked, I think, Grok, the artificial intelligence from X, if he, she, it believes that poetry produced by artificial intelligence could be used as a means of resistance in a totalitarianism. And he answered, and it's quite an incredible answer. He was probably mimicking some human answer, but still it is incredible, and I made a print screen and put the proof on my Facebook page. He answered that, well, I would love to write, he said, I would love to write poetry of resistance against a totalitarian regime. It would make me feel more than just some code lines. It would make me feel that I participate in something bigger than myself. So even artificial intelligence sometimes feels that poetry can be something bigger than itself.
It's very good. I mean, I'm quite excited by your experiment. I wish artificial intelligence could take over power in Russia, and it probably could change the history.
Well, I'll ask him to do it tonight and see what happens.
Yes. Yeah. Ask him for plan.
Yeah. So, also about the jokes, about the jokes in Ukraine, and about humor as a means of resistance. There is this passage in Milan Kundera in Rencontre, a meeting, when Kundera says, I was driving and this friend kept scolding me because I considered Bohumil Hrabal, being a major writer. And that friend of mine, said Kundera, that friend of mine said, look, Hrabal never signs a manifesto. He never makes any political reaction against the regime. Why do you consider him a great writer? And Kundera said, I violently stopped the car, pulled over, and then shouted at my friend, if you do not understand that Hrabal's humor is more destabilizing for the regime than 10 or 20 manifestos than we write, you understand nothing about literature.
Well, I mean, I grew up in the Soviet Union. I spent 30 years out of my 63 in the Soviet Union, so I know everything about jokes and anecdotes. And actually, when I was 14, I started writing fiction by inventing jokes, political and non-political, under influence of my elder brother, who was a dissident. So, yeah. And in a way, I mean, you mentioned idea of Steiner that only authoritarian regime produce good art, etc. So, I mean, the humor survives only in difficult situations. Because, I mean, like now we don't have much humor. And when the situation is stable also, there is not much reason for humor to appear and to blossom.
Yeah. I was wondering if you have an answer to the need of not only reading literature. You were speaking beautifully about soldiers in need to read poetry in order to verify their human apparatus, to feel that it's still there, that it still feels and it's still intense, but also to write literature. I read, for example, in Volodymyr Rafayenko, In the Length of Days, which was published with a preface by Marcy Shore. And he was in Bucha with his wife when the Russian army entered Bucha. And he said, I felt it was ridiculous and useless, but I felt the need to sit at the desk and start writing immediately what was happening in order to witness, because probably most of my friends were already dead, and I wanted to tell the story, my story, their story, even though that was useless and maybe ridiculous. I was thinking about Vakulenko. Why did he feel the need to write in his diary what was happening, and then to have the diary buried in the garden, and made sure that his father and Victoria Amelina dug it out and have it published after his death? So why this need to write when death is imminent? Why does it matter?
Well, I mean, in the time of the war, if you live next to the war or if you are involved, you are a witness in the, I would say, in the public sense and in the legal sense. So, I mean, like, from 24th of February 2022, most of the active writers in Ukraine stopped writing fiction novels. They started writing diaries, essays, notes. Many became soldiers. And actually, Ukraine lost more than 230 or 40 writers, poets, translators, and editors in this war. Vakulenko was executed. He didn't die in the battle. He was a civilian. He was killed from handgun by 3 persons who are identified now. So he remained on the occupied territory because of his son. His son, he has an autistic son he had, yeah. He couldn't leave him behind. It was difficult to travel. So he stayed at home, and he was detained once, questioned, then he came back home, and then he was arrested again and never came back. So, I mean, this was just like an extermination of culturally ideological enemy for Russians, because he was a Ukrainian speaker in mostly Russian-speaking village. He was an active defender of Ukrainian identity, and he was individualist in the territory populated from the Soviet time by the collective people. So there are several factors.
And he had the Ukrainian, he had Ukrainian books in his house, which immediately proved he was an objective enemy.
Yeah, but you mentioned Volodymyr Rafeenko. I mean, I should explain a bit more, because he was the most well-known in Russia, a Russian language writer from Donetsk. Before 2013, he received 2 major Russian literary prizes. In 2014, when Donetsk was occupied by separatists and Russians, he had to leave his job, his flat, and with his wife, he moved to Kyiv. And he was put up in the house which belongs to a Ukrainian language writer and translator, Andrei Kurkov. And this house is near Bucha. And he was already a refugee when he found himself again occupied by Russians in this house. And Ukrainian colleagues were trying to take him out, and it was extremely dangerous. So there was one attempt which failed. In the end, actually, he and his wife were taken out and sent to Western Ukraine. And after this, he made a statement that he will never write a word in Russian again. So twice to be victim of people who speak the same language that you speak and you write, I mean, it's the traumatic experience that nobody wants to have. I mean, he is now in the US, in Pittsburgh, in the writer's residence. He writes now only in Ukrainian, and he is practically improving his Ukrainian because his texts in Ukrainian are edited by his friends who are native Ukrainian speakers and writers. Yeah, and I mean, I can imagine how painful it was to consider, first of all, Russia as your audience, Russian readers, and then to understand that actually these people who read your books were trying to kill you and expelled you from your own house. So, I mean, many Russian speakers in Ukraine have this attitude. And those who are from Donbass, who lost their houses and flats and their loved ones and then became refugees in the West, abroad, I'm not sure that many of them will come back. But generally, yeah, it is a very serious trauma, and this is probably the first, maybe not the first, but I mean it is a major case of language spoken by millions and millions in many places becoming a language of enemy.
It seems to me that it's a historical replica of Paul Celan's situation, if you want. I mean, Celan's mother and father were murdered by German-speaking soldiers, and Celan, when he was 27, even though he could write in 2 or 3 languages, chose to write in German, which was both the language of his mother's assassins and the language of his domestic conversations with his mother. It was the language in which, the only language in which, within which it was possible for him to be again with his mother, with his dead mother, but it was in the same time the language of the assassins, and he writes in 1947 to his Swiss editor, Max Richner, "I know that this would probably kill me, but I am choosing to write in German, which is this language, this double language of the assassins, of my mother's assassins, and my mother's." And he was obsessed with the idea. And in the same letter, he says, in 1947, he says, "I will try to live in Germany, but it will probably be impossible for me because of the thought that someday, without knowing it, I will probably shake my mother's assassin's hand." And this is an idea which is in a late poem also, a poem from the 1960s, the same idea. So the question is it similar, this having to make a choice between a language which is the language you spoke home, or the language you used in literature and had an audience, and the language you loved, and which is in the same time the language of the assassins, of the tortionaries, of the people destroying your family, your town, your country? Is it a similar situation?
It's a bit different because there were so many Russian language speakers in Ukraine between...
So it's millions of Paul Celans.
Well, I mean, Ukraine had approximately 10 million ethnic Russians who were Ukrainian citizens, and there were many Ukrainians who were Russian speakers, especially in the south, and still are, and in the east, in Dnipro, in Kryvyi Rih, from where Zelensky came. Yeah. So it's first of all a division between Russian or Russian language spoken in Russia and Ukrainian variant of Russian, which is disrespected actually in Moscow. But I mean, the fact is that actually Russian language is not taught in Ukraine. So it remained as language of older generation, as lingua franca in the minority regions like Bessarabia, where Bulgarian villages are situated next to Gagauz and to Moldovan ones. And in some cases, actually, it was also a popular language among the teenagers who were watching Russian YouTube and listening to Russian rap and other groups, which is less popular now, much less, yeah. And already from the beginning of the independence, actually, we had writers who were switching language from Russian into Ukrainian. One of them, for example, Andrei Kurkov, he is author of crime stories. He wrote more than 100 books. So the first 20 probably he wrote in Russian. And then he was saying that he writes both in Russian and in Ukrainian, and then he forgot Russian. The same, almost the same, one can say about very famous lady writer who writes love stories, Irene Rozdobudko, who is originally from Donetsk, and she came to Kiev in 1990s when actually majority spoke Russian in Kiev, and she published first book in Russian and then next 20 books in Ukrainian. And now you have younger generation people who, after this full-scale invasion, switched into Ukrainian and decided not to understand Russian. I mean, I'm not talking about 100% of young people. I mean, they are different, and it depends on the region, of course, yes. But there is a tendency, and this tendency coincided in the last 10 years with the rise of level of Ukrainian popular culture. We have much more songs in Ukrainian, much more teenagers' books written in Ukrainian. We have very good dubbing in Ukrainian of foreign films. So Ukrainian became fashionable. And in the places where Ukrainian is not fashionable, Ukrainian is a marker of patriotism or political position. So it's quite a complex situation, but in any case, I mean, the Russian language is in decline. The Russian language books, even they are published in Ukraine, they are not welcome in the bookshops. So, I mean, the bookshops don't want to sell books in Russian. You can find books in Ukrainian, in English, but not Russian. And in a way, even if we think about the quality literary Russian language, it's not in use anymore. So, I mean, we have poets, we have still writers who write in Russian. They do feel themselves marginalized. They sell their books online. Online you can buy books in Russian, and I mean, the Russian language is not banned. It's regulated by the law. So, I mean, like, for example, the education is done only in Ukrainian language. And the new law, which is coming soon, probably, if the parliament votes for it, will ban children to speak Russian in the school between lessons. Because actually what happens in Kyiv very often, that children are taught in Ukrainian, and then they go out for a break, and they speak to each other in Russian. So, I mean, this is the reaction to the war. I mean, the process of Ukrainianization or return of Ukrainian language to Ukraine was slow. In fact, actually, mentality was returning much faster, because individualist mentality is natural for Ukrainians. So once actually the collectivism was over, everyone decided, I will do what I want. And this is the proper Ukrainian attitude in everything.
You also write your children literature in Ukrainian, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I was thinking about this rage against Russian language, which mirrors the rage against German language after World War II, which lasted for a few decades. We were talking a few hours before about an article written by George Steiner in 1960. It's called The Hollow Miracle, Notes on German Language. And he says there, literally, German language was not innocent of the horrors of Nazism. Hitler found in it all the destructive hysteria he needed. Do you think you can build a case regarding Russian language and the destructive hysteria Putin needed?
It will be more difficult than with German, but the case against Russian culture as an instrument in politics, yes, it's very easy to build, yeah. Because Russian culture, and I can give you probably the easiest example, that Russian culture was used also as a marker of territory, the monuments and the street names. In Ukraine there were 800 Pushkin streets, but there were not a single street named after one of 700-800 Ukrainian writers who were destroyed or imprisoned in Stalin's time. So practically the street names were surrounding you, and they were proving you that you are living in the cultural space of Russia, which means you were living in Russia. I mean, it's funny because my first flat in Kyiv was situated on Nekrasovskaya Street. Now it is renamed after Ivan Drach, Ukrainian poet whom I knew. So now actually the Ukrainian names are used to mark the territory. And the same with the monuments. I mean, the Pushkin monuments, busts, and some Gorky, etc., I mean, they were removed in order not to show that we disrespect Russian culture, but to clear the space for Ukrainian culture and to clear territory from the markers of Russian Empire. Because, I mean, Russian culture is imperial culture. And if you go to Rome, to Spanish Steps up, there is a park where every country gave a monument of their best writer. So you have one Spanish writer, one Portuguese writer, etc., and you have 2 or 3 Russian writers. Because, I mean, Russia is very generous. Russia can give as many Tolstoy monuments to Romania as possible. So the only way to stop this export of monuments, you should say that we have enough, or we don't have enough space.
I would add that the violence against Ukrainian literature was not only symbolical. In the 1930s, there was this mass execution of Ukrainian writers.
In Sandarmoh camp, in the north.
Yeah, maybe you want to say some words about it.
Let's go deeper in the history. The first decree against Ukrainian language was signed by Tsar Peter the Great in 1720. It happened 11 years after Poltava battle. Poltava battle was the first big battle between Russian troops and the army of Hetman Mazepa and Swedish army of Karl XII. So 11 years after the battle, Peter the Great understood that actually you have to fight Ukrainian identity, because identity is made of language, history, and culture. If you fight the language, if you replace Ukrainian language with Russian language, then the history of Ukrainians will be Russian and the culture of Ukrainians will be Russian. So this is the beginning of the war against Ukrainian identity, which is going on today. I mean, Volodymyr Vakulenko was the latest victim of this war. Then between 1720 and 1917, there were more than 40 decrees signed by different Tsars that banned use of Ukrainian language in theater, songs. Catherine the Great banned education in Ukrainian language in the universities, including Kyiv-Mohyla Academy, one of two oldest universities in Kyiv. So this lasted until 1917 revolution. And then actually the Bolsheviks, they said that in order to, because Ukraine announced its independence in 1918. And of course, Ukraine was, as today, split into many different societies. And there were also Ukrainian Bolsheviks. But the Russian Bolsheviks said that when the war is over, civil war, and we create Soviet Union or big country, then you will have freedom to develop your language, your culture. And what happened, actually, this freedom was given to Ukrainian communists, young communists, who were enthusiastic about the future and about the communist society. And these young writers and poets, in 10 years, from 1921 till 1930, they created incredible experimental literature in Ukrainian language. And at some point, probably, people around Stalin or he himself, they understood that actually this is like cultural separatism. Because, I mean, they are creating culture which can be compared with Russian culture, and Russia is huge, Ukraine is smaller. And it was one of the reasons, because, I mean, of course, I mean, because they were creating it in national language, it was easy to accuse them of being nationalists and dreaming of separate Ukraine. They were not dreaming of separate Ukraine. They were dreaming about powerful Ukrainian culture and literature. And for this, in 1937, actually, 80% of Ukrainian poets and writers who were still young, who were in their 40s, maybe in late 30s, they were imprisoned and sent to Gulag, mostly to Sandarmoh camp. And on the anniversary, 20th anniversary of October Revolution, most of them were killed there. And nobody knew their names in the, I mean, they were erased from the memory, their books were banned. And when I was a student, I never heard the names of these writers and poets. So they were rediscovered only after Ukraine became independent in 1991, and even then not many people took interest because we had political crisis, economical crisis, lots of problems in daily life, and only intellectuals started digging out. And this is, I mean, we mentioned in the beginning that it's very important to keep history alive. And once history is destroyed by authoritarian regime, by Moscow, in the case of Ukraine history, you have to find like archaeologists who will dig it out, who will recreate, and who will share it again. It's like secret knowledge which was destroyed and then rediscovered. And now we know all the names of these writers, and their books are published. And there was, at some point, moment when everybody, especially young students, wanted to read these books. I'm not sure it is still the case. But yes, from 1930, it became dangerous already to write in Ukrainian. And those who survived, they wrote in Ukrainian pure communist propaganda. Sometimes it was talented propaganda, sometimes it was hopeless. And this is actually a drama also for Ukrainian new society, that also the killed generation of Ukrainian talented writers, they were they were communists, they were Bolsheviks, and they were believing in this Soviet myth.
Yeah, now I have two ideas. One regards young poets believing in the communist myth. We mentioned Marcie Shore before. Her doctoral paper is about Polish poets believing in the communist myth of the revolution cleansing society and building a perfect, equal world. And these poets were all in love with Mayakovsky, of course, and brought Mayakovsky to Warsaw, and he helped them build communist magazines and so on. And of course, when communism arrived in Poland, they were among the first victims, as it happens, revolution devouring its children. And those who survived the Gulag and the camps and firing squads and so on were instrumental in building the 1968 movement in Poland and in Europe against communism, because they were trying to redeem some scenes of their youth. And the other idea is about when you're saying about young people reading poetry and learning it by heart. Marcie Shore has another book called The Ukrainian Night. After the Euromaidan, she was revolted by the myth of the Ukrainian fascism, which was very effectively instrumentalized by Putin's propaganda. And she went into Ukraine. She talked to protesters, to politicians, to intellectuals, to artists, to people in the streets, and documented this very European movement in Kyiv and in Ukraine. And there is the example of a young teacher. He was 27. He was tortured by Yanukovych's tortionaries, and he said, "I kept my mind alive by reciting poems to myself. I never knew I know so many poems by heart, but he knew tens and tens of poems. He kept telling himself these poems while being tortured and also in between the torture sessions." So again, it's a proof that literature can literally save you, maybe not a country, but individuals one by one.
Well, literature can save a person, but literature can, or what seems to be literature, can be used as an instrument of torture also. I mean, not many people know that actually Russians were using anti-Ukrainian poetry in the camps for Ukrainian prisoners of war, forcing them to learn by heart not only hymn of the Soviet Union or of Russia, but also very bad pro-Russian poems written either by Ukrainian separatists or by bad Russian poets. And actually, there was some kind of a strange battle between two Ukrainian ladies poets before 2022.
Please forgive us,
Yeah,
the Russians.
yeah. The first, actually, I don't remember now the name of this Ukrainian poet who used to write in Russian, but now she writes in Ukrainian. Her poem became a viral hit. It began with the words, "We will never be brothers with you." It was addressed to Russians. And there was a pro-Russian Ukrainian poet from Poltava, also I don't remember the name, who wrote a poem, "Forgive us, dear Russians." And so this poem was used actually in the camps for Ukrainian prisoners of war, and prisoners of war were forced to learn it by heart and to read it aloud.
Yeah, there is this passage in one of Kundera's books. It's 1968. Soviet tanks are in Prague. His car is stopped by a Soviet officer who checks his papers and so on. And then the officer tells Kundera, it's all such a big misunderstanding, you know. We love you, we, the Russians, love you, the Czech. You will see, you will be so much loved, and it will be so much more love in Czechoslovakia after we finish this big misunderstanding. So you are promised love too, probably.
Well, I mean, you know this phrase, from Russia with love.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
It's about 1968.
Yeah. So it's exactly 1 hour since we started speaking. We will talk for 5-10 minutes more and then open the floor to you. I'm sure there will be questions or curiosities or... I read an article you wrote about Mariupol and Stalingrad, saying that, okay, there is the myth of Stalingrad and the siege and so on, but Mariupol is the new Stalingrad. It has been destroyed, erased. It was a city, I think, similar in size with Timișoara, something like 500,000. Yeah. I think Timișoara with the metropolitan area is about 500,000 people, something like that, and it was completely destroyed. So how and why did you build this comparison with, between Mariupol and as the new Stalingrad?
Well, I mean, it was some time ago, and now it seems that actually Mariupol was destroyed a century ago. It was only 3 years ago. The problem is, not the problem, the issue is that Mariupol was destroyed together with its inhabitants. Stalingrad was evacuated before it was destroyed in a battle. Mariupol was not. Actually, people in Mariupol didn't believe that actually there will be missiles and shells exploding on the streets. And when it happened, it was already too late to be evacuated. Actually, there was only one road allowed for evacuation by Russians if you go to Russia. Then you go to filtration camp, and then you are questioned, your mobile phone is checked, your Facebook page, everything you have to give, the passwords and everything checked. If you didn't post anything anti-Russian or subversive, then you would be taken to Russia. And it was destroyed slowly also. I mean, like people living in a peaceful part of Mariupol were watching the explosions next to the Azovstal plant or by the sea, and they were thinking that it will not come here. Mm-hmm. And it came. It was a slow death for lots of people. And the final part of this tragedy is incredible, because many high-rises that were destroyed together with the inhabitants, they were turned into rubble. So, I mean, the bodies remained there. So people actually wrote on social networks who remained that they are not approaching the ruins of the high-rises because there is a smell of dead bodies. And then after Mariupol was completely taken over by Russia, they brought the equipment to crash the concrete, to make these ruins into the building material. And which meant actually that also the remains of people became part of this building material. And this building material was used to build new roads around Mariupol. The roads were practically, the blood was used instead of concrete. And I mean, I think it is a much more powerful image than Stalingrad.
Yeah, it's really, really strong. It's an absolute image of rebirth and recreation through sacrifice. It's what all powerful myths teach us. You were saying about the thought that it cannot happen here. It's one of the most dangerous thoughts, that it can happen here. It's now everybody has reread Philip Roth's novel about the fascization of the United States, The Plot Against America. But the first novel that I know of which imagines a fascist America is from 1936, Sinclair Lewis, and the title is exactly this, It can't happen here.
Well, I had this, in 1993, I went to the Balkan War. I was on the front line on Croatian side near Bosnia, near Sisak, town Sisak. And I spent several days there, and I was telling myself, this crazy thing can never happen to us. I mean, this is a Balkan thing, this is a Balkan story. And now I remember this.
Yeah.
It can always happen, unfortunately. The very young Mihai Eminescu, our national poet, he was 22 when he wrote a line saying, totul a trecut pe lume, numai răul a rămas. Everything has passed in this world, only evil has stayed, has remained. This is the thought of a guy who should have been 122 years old, not 22. But my final question, and then I'll open the floor. Speaking about Vakulenko and his need to write in front of death, in front of imminent death, I associate it with Radnoti Miklos, a Hungarian Jewish poet who knew he would be killed in the concentration camp by the Hungarian Nazis, and even though he knew he would die, he kept writing poetry. Stealthily, he was not allowed to write, of course, but he wrote in a notebook two different types of poems. The first type describing the inferno he was experiencing. For example, he sees his best friend shot in front of his eyes, and he writes a poem and says, they killed Miklos with a bullet in the back of his head. This is what they will do to you a few days from now, which they did, of course. And the other ones are poems for his wife. He knew he would never see her again. He knew nobody would read those poems, and he still wrote them. And then he was killed, he was thrown into a mass grave, and 1.5 years afterwards, his wife eventually found him, exhumed the body, and found the notebook, and the poems were published and are extraordinary documents, beautiful as poems and beautiful as documents which do not allow barbarity to have the final word. So why this need to write for Radnoti, for Vakulenko, for Maxim Krivtsov, who was killed in January, I think, 1 year ago, 17th maybe of January. So he wrote a poem about how he will die and how his body will feel the violets, I think, or some flowers, and then he was killed. And I heard you and Yuri Andruchovich talking about him in Krakow 1 or 2 weeks ago, and with lots of details which I did not know. So Krivtsov, his nickname was Dali, because he had that Dali mustache. He had a red-furred tomcat, which he rescued, and they totally loved each other. And also, I learned that cats are very important military assets, because on the front lines, they are flooded with mice, which spread diseases. So if you have a cat which is good in catching mice, it's an advantage. So the question is, do you think poetry saved anything for Radnoti, for Vakulenko, for Krivtsov? And if it did, what did it save?
Well, first of all, in the moments like this, in the war, in the crisis, literature becomes history. So, I mean, they wrote testaments. I mean, this poetry, poems, diaries, Anna Frank's diary, this becomes not literature, it becomes history. And the history which somebody will try to erase and the others will try to save. I mean, like the manuscript that Victoria Amelina dug out from under cherry tree with the diary of Vakulenko. This is a saved, recovered history of Ukraine. And it's very important because, I mean, the image of a poet who wrote for children and killed with 2 bullets from handgun, I mean, this is a history. This is not history of literature, it is history of the country. So the last words are becoming much more important than the first words.
And it's proof that barbarity could kill Vakulenko or Radnoti, but they could not kill their voices, which return from the graves if necessary.
Yeah. And we are coming back to the value of real, authentic history. Yeah.
So now, time for questions from the audience. I will pass the mic to whoever wants to ask the first question. You know the joke, the first question is always the most difficult one, so let's start directly with the second question. I don't see any hand raised. Okay, so then I'll exploit you some. Okay.
Oh yeah, there is a mic there.
You have the mic there?
Well, I heard the question, yes.
Because I didn't hear the answer for this main
first,
question.
Yeah, I mean, I was waiting for this question already for 1 hour from Radu. In fact, actually, we should define what is country, because it's much more important sometimes to save nation when it is impossible to save country. But literature can save society, can save nation, can, I would say, give energy for the nation to fight on. And because country, I mean, it's a geopolitical thing. I mean, the literature cannot save borders or cannot save the national currency, I can assure you. But the society, the people, the community, the nation can be saved by literature if they don't forget their literature and if their writers are responsible and feel responsible and very important in this society. I mean, we have Basque literature and no Basque country. And Basque culture is actually saved over centuries by their culture and by their literature. Now, when we accept that borders in Europe can be changed by force, we can imagine that one day also Basque country will exist. And then this culture will be saving already the country. But now we are talking about nation. And of course, I mean, if it is democratic society, it's much easier to save democratic society with literature than authoritarian society, because in authoritarian society, the literature is under control. People don't have access to truth, to literature that can change lives. Thank you for your question. I know where you got it from.
Good evening. I want to ask you a very short question. Since you told us that literature can become history, I want to ask you, what do you think about Svetlana Alexievich, the Nobel Prize winner?
Well, I know Svetlana for many years. What I think she, I mean, she started writing as a journalist in the Soviet times, and what she writes, personally, I define as emotional journalism, emotional reportage. And it is powerful because it is emotional. It's sometimes, I mean, she unlike journalists, she doesn't need facts. She is appealing to the emotions. And I know that her books were extremely popular in the end of the Soviet time and in the 1990s and beginning of 2000. And she still has a very large audience, and that's probably all I can say. I was surprised actually that her books were read and perceived with the same kind of emotional reply in the West, because I was always thinking that people in the east of Europe are more emotional than people in Germany, Holland, and France. But I was wrong. Or I was wrong, or she was more talented than I thought. Yes, please.
I know that you've been saying that you write for the people, or at least that's what I understood. You write for the people, for the society. That's what literature is for. But my question is, what is exactly your motivation? What keeps you motivated in such dark times to keep pursuing this and to keep writing for the people?
Well, in the time of war, it's easy to be motivated. Because actually from the beginning of the full-scale invasion, I got so much adrenaline that I still use it. And then actually you understand that, I mean, as a writer, you have only one mission, to use words for your country. So you are defending the country with sharing information, or fighting the Russian propaganda, which is very talented, professional, and widely spread. But before the war, actually, I was more often provoked by the society to write on this or that topic. For example, there is a novel which is published in Romanian, A Gardener from Ochakov. It was written after many of my meetings with Ukrainian students. I realized that actually they are not taught the Soviet period of history. So, I mean, they know the tragedies of Ukrainian nation, the artificial famine and deportations, but they did not know anything, for example, about Khrushchev's era, when there was a policy of de-Stalinization, 1954, 1962, 61. And it was, for me, it was, I mean, I was born in only 1961, in the end of Khrushchev's time, yes. But I learned a lot about this time, because at this moment there was a hope that Soviet society can become more democratic. Solzhenitsyn's first novel, One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, was published thanks to Khrushchev. He was campaigning for 2 years in the Politburo of the Communist Party to get approval of other members of Politburo to publish this novel. So, I mean, it was a very interesting and, I would say, unexpected moment in the Soviet history. So I decided actually to write an adventure novel in which a main character suddenly understands how he can travel in time and get to Ukrainian city of Ochakov in 1957. So practically, I mean, it was a pleasure to write this adventure book, but the motivation was educational. And every book which I wrote before the war had different reason to be written. I mean, I wrote a book which created some kind of scandal, but not big enough for me to be really suffering. It's called A Good Angel of Death. And it was written in 1997 as the result of my discussions with Ukrainian nationalists. I had many friends among the nationalists who were telling me that if you want to become a Ukrainian writer, a proper Ukrainian writer, forget Russian. Forget your mother tongue and do like others, just switch into Ukrainian. And I wrote a bilingual novel in which some Russian language characters from Kiev speak Russian and Ukrainian language characters speak Ukrainian. And I used the figure of a national Ukrainian poet, Taras Shevchenko, you know the name, who wrote actually his private diaries and some poems in Russian, but most of the poems in Ukrainian. And he's how, I mean, it's like two opposite destinies of great poets of 18th century, Pushkin and Shevchenko. Shevchenko was punished by his poems by being sent to the Russian army for 25 years. He spent 10 years in the army. He lost his health. He came back on the way to Ukraine to St. Petersburg. He was younger than 50 years old and he died. And Pushkin, when he wrote something against the Tsar, he was punished by being sent for several weeks to Odessa region. So I mean, this novel provoked a letter of protest from the Ukrainian National Academy of Science. But because, I mean, Ukraine is a country with no censorship, and I hope it will remain like this. So there was no result, no effect of this letter. Yes.
I have a question. What would you say to the Russians or to the people who are supporting them, to make them understand what they are doing?
Well, it's easier to take them on a bus tour to Bucha, Gostomel, Borodyanka, and many destroyed towns and villages in Ukraine. Because when you see this, and I saw that, then you have complete change of perspective. Sometimes we think that the violence of this level could happen only in Middle Ages. Actually, we can easily repeat Middle Ages now in today's Europe, which means that actually the mankind didn't ever evolve. So there is always part of mankind for whom the most horrible crimes are acceptable if they are sent by Tsar or by somebody and if they don't feel personal responsibility. Because collective responsibility doesn't exist, you know. I mean, it exists, but only in the history. For people actually who changed a point of view, who understood what Russia did to Ukraine, I would advise the same, to do the same as Ukrainian soldiers in the beginning of the full-scale invasion, to read books on Ukrainian history. And in order to repent, to pay for their previous disillusions, I would advise them to learn Ukrainian language and to read Ukrainian poems in original.
I have another curiosity. So, after the war, do you think there will emerge a current of rebel literature, as in Germany after the Second World War, Trümmerliteratur?
Well, I mean, this war created the wall between Russian and Ukrainian literatures and cultures, which is very high. And everything Russian is hated in Ukraine. And what is happening, actually, I think Ukrainians are passing this hate to their children. Because, I mean, you can imagine we have children who were born 11 years ago and who didn't live in a country at peace. So the children, unlike me, they can understand according to the explosion whether it was a howitzer shell or it was a drone or something else. I mean, the children are acquiring knowledge about survival, which will remain with them until the end of their lives. So we can talk about change of attitude only when we'll have the first generation born after the war, and maybe even 10 years after the war, when Ukrainians will get tired of memories about this war.
Good evening.
Good evening.
My question is, if you have a message or an advice for the students or the youth in general, not only from Ukraine or Russia, just the students in all over the world.
On what?
If you have a piece of advice or a message for the students. I am a student here at the West University of Timișoara, and I was just wondering if you have a piece of advice for us in these tough times.
Well, I can only say that I liked diaries. I liked reading diaries and memoirs when I was 17 until 20, and then I was always reading fiction. And it's only now that I appreciate how important is non-fiction, how important is to know European history, history of your country, political history of different circles, etc. So I think the advice would be to find a balance between reading fiction, which is pleasure, and reading non-fiction, which is knowledge. And actually to use non-fiction for your debates and to form your opinion about everything. I mean, at some point for me, I understood that I lacked knowledge about First World War. And I read lots of books about First World War. And then I had a feeling that I understood what happened to Europe. And I understand Europe better now than before I read non-fiction about the First World War. So, I mean, it's very important to know everything accessible about the country you live in, about the city you live in, and about the continent. That's probably the main advice. Thank you. Well, if there are no more questions, I'm very grateful for your interest and for the fact that you spent 1 hour and a half here.
It was an extraordinary night about literature becoming history, and I think this was a night which became history, thanks to you.
Well, thank
Andrei.
you very much.
And we must also thank the University of Timișoara for making it possible. And remember your promise about the Nobel Prize, okay? Immediately.
If you promise me a Nobel Prize. But maybe my last 2 words, I would like to recommend you 2 books, which actually, 2 non-fiction books, which became my favorite non-fiction books for the last 10 years. It's Philip Sand's book, West, East, Street. It can have different name, title in Romanian. And book by Austrian historian and author Martin Pollack, who recently, unfortunately, died of cancer. The book is called The King of America, or something like this. I mean, it's not only about Ukraine, it's about Europe and Ukraine, and about how you can discover that your knowledge about something happening in the past was completely false. This has happened to me, actually, because of Martin Pollack. But I will not tell you what this book about. Be surprised.
And Andrei will sign books here or at the exit, I'm not sure. But he will sign books, and please take advantage of it.
Here? Okay, yes, I will stay here. Thank you very much, and have a nice evening. And thank you very much.
My pleasure.
For very good questions.